Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Last week, we spoke about the work of Jeremy Silman and his system of imbalances as a way of thinking. We spoke about his books and some of his online courses. So last week was really about Silman's content. This week, I want to take a deeper dive into his system of imbalances and talk about what that looks like realistically and practically for the amateur player. It's one thing to talk about the theory of his imbalances and what they are, but how does an amateur player or a club player apply that? Like, what does that look like? That's what I want to get into this week. As part of this discussion, I want to address some flaws or some caveats, really, about Silman's system. While I do believe in it, I think there are some potential red flags for club players, in my view. There's also been criticism of his imbalances by others. We're going to look at that. I want to be very clear. I believe in his system. I think it's important. I think it's essential for improvement. But what I'm saying is it's not a perfect system, and there are some pitfalls you have to watch out for. In other words, in my opinion, when you use Silman's system, which again, I believe is essential, the pros far outweigh the cons. I just think there's a few things you need to keep in mind as far as its practical application. So I'm going to discuss my own personal issues with the imbalances, really nitpicks. I wouldn't call them flaws. They're really nitpicks. But I'm also going to discuss what others have said about the imbalances, because I am perfectly aware that there are some out there who have criticized Silman's system. I'm going to address that. So this is a continuation of last week's episode so that I can present this as balanced as possible. We're going to kind of look at the other side of it, so to speak. So I'm going to start with this. Before you think positionally in terms of the imbalances, you must look at threats and tactics first. Silman says this, yes, but my nitpick is that I don't believe he emphasizes that nearly enough. Only when you've determined that there's no immediate threats, tactics, or mates should you then think positionally. And here's how I think amateurs should approach a position. I still do this to this day. Now, as you get stronger, this will become more instinctive, and the sort of checklist nature of it will kind of go away, because you will have internalized it. But here's what you need to do. So when you face a position, the first thing you need to say, the very first thing, what is the threat, right? Because your opponent just moved. What is the threat? Is he threatening something? Is he threatening me? Is he threatening to take something? If you've determined that there are no immediate threats, which is probably most positions, you can then go on to step 2, which is, do I have a tactic? Right? Do I have a tactical shot? Do I have a mating net? Can I win material? Do I have any type of immediate way to win material? Any type of tactic or sort of immediate advantage type of thing? That's step 2. Now, assuming that neither of those are in place, in other words, your opponent doesn't have any threats, you don't have any tactics or anything that you can capture, any kind of checkmate, then we go to number 3. Which is to think in terms of a plan, to think positionally, to think of the imbalances. So in other words, you're only going to think positionally and think in terms of long-term planning, thinking in terms of Silman imbalances after you've determined that there's no threats on the part of your opponent, and after you've determined that you don't have any type of tactic. Then you look at positional ideas, all right, which is step 3. Basically, again, step 1, what is the threat? Is there a threat? If not, do I have a tactic or any type of shot? Then number 3, if neither of those are in place, you look positionally, think of plans, the imbalances, and then when you come up with your final move, your intended move, you need to do a blunder check. And this is the part where most amateurs fail or where they come up short. You've done all this thinking, you've done all this work on your move, even if it's only a few minutes, right? But you've come up with a move. Does your intended move work? You have to do a blunder check. It may seem like a fantastic move because it fits positionally and it seems to help achieve a certain goal, but you have to check that it's not tactically flawed. And the way I usually think is, what does he have? How is it wrong? You have to almost be cynical. When I studied with international master Danny Kopak, the late Danny Kopak, rest his soul, he used to always say, when you come up with your intended move, you almost have to be cynical. Like you have to try to find something wrong with it. That's actually a basis of game theory, right? Game theory, you basically come up with an idea and you say, all right, what's wrong with it? You try to pick it apart. You kind of have to do that. But that's step 4, that blunder check, where you have to check that your intended move doesn't fail tactically, that he doesn't have a winning response. You have to do that. That's how you should think. So the imbalances and thinking positionally doesn't come into play until after you've determined that there's no threat and no tactics, that type of thing. And I think that's important. Silman does say that, but again, I think he needs to emphasize that even more. Now, I'd like to go into an aside about the argument that tactics will always beat out positional play, because that's a big part of the discourse at the amateur level. Tactical prowess versus positional or strategic prowess. Now, I don't agree that tactics always wins out. There's a belief that in the amateur ranks that positional play is moot because it's a tactical shot that ends up winning, and that quote-unquote sharp tactical play will always beat out quote-unquote strategic positional play. While that certainly does happen, I've won plenty of games against tactical maniacs. Now, Silman does say that quite often it is a tactical shot that wins, but that's not usually because the winning player is a tactical genius. It's because the opponent blunders. That's the amateur level. You play almost GM level moves and then you commit an elementary blunder on move 32 and it's over. Here's my take. You need to combine your strategic play with a strong tactical foundation, and then you'll be a dangerous player. In other words, don't neglect either of those. You don't want to be so focused on strategic play that you forget basic tactics. For example, you may see a move that'll help you control a file, but you miss that it's flawed tactically. So that balance between the two of those is very important. Another nitpick I have with Silman's system, or not really a nitpick, but just something that you need to watch out for, is that his system of imbalances and his general thinking philosophy can lead to perfectionism. I've spoken about the power of passive moves or quote unquote waiting moves, really. I think waiting moves is a better term. One of the issues I have with Silman is that he's too dismissive of alternate moves or adequate moves. These waiting moves can be very effective at the amateur level when you're not sure what to do. By the way, the idea that quote unquote a bad plan is better than no plan is idiotic. That's one of those expressions floating out there. A bad plan is bad. Don't play it. If you're not sure what to do, play a harmless waiting move and let the other guy force things. Don't worry about it being too passive. Now, for those of you who haven't heard me speak about this, what I refer to as a waiting move is sort of a harmless nothing move where you just shuffle a piece or you do something like A3 or H3 as long as it doesn't weaken your position. You know, maybe you'll shuffle a rook. The idea is that you're almost passing it on to the other player because you're not sure what to do. And you're kind of almost saying, all right, I don't think either of us knows what to do. I'm going to play this nothing move that's neither good nor bad. And I'm going to hope that you force things and blunder. And with Silman, there's this sense of you either find the best positional move or you've failed. And that's a dangerous road to go down. His system of imbalances can lead to perfectionism and the ensuing time pressure that goes along with that if you take his system too literally. This is especially important for club level time controls such as game 90 or game 60 or game 75. If you take his system too literally, you're going to get into time pressure every time. His system of imbalances is a tool in your toolkit to understand what's happening in a position. Another crucial point, I alluded to this earlier, but it bears repeating. As you get stronger, your skills at reading a position will become faster and more instinctual rather than having to go through sort of a checklist every time. But that takes a lot of experience to get to that point. For example, that list I mentioned earlier, right? You want to first think, what is the threat? And then if there's no threat on the part of your opponent, do you have a tactic? And if you don't have a tactic, then you think positionally as far as a plan and the imbalances. And then number 4 would be to do a blunder check of your intended move. And if you realize that your intended move is a blunder, if it doesn't work, then you have to go back. But as you get stronger, you won't necessarily have to go through 1, 2, 3, 4 like that because it'll become instinctive. Like when your opponent moves, you'll just know, okay, he just moved. I have to check for threats. That comes with experience. That comes with playing, comes with a lot of over-the-board tournaments. Now let's talk about the reality of reading chess positions. Let's say it like it is. We're amateur players. We're sitting in an over-the-board tournament. And here's the deal. Here's the reality. Despite your best efforts, and no matter how strong of a player you might be, you are going to face positions where you will not know what to do. I don't care if you read all of Silman's books 10 times from cover to cover. Imbalances, schmalances. It ain't happening. There are going to be times where you are just not sure what the plan is. Even GMs talk about that. I mean, it's on a different level, but you'll hear GMs in their own analysis say it was unclear, I wasn't sure what to do. So if they're struggling with it, think about us at the amateur level. And here's the thing. You don't need to come up with an intricate plan or even any plan on every move. That's what I mean about not taking his system literally. Not every move requires an intricate plan. Now, in those positions where you're not sure what to do, we talked about waiting moves, which is kind of like a check in poker. It's sort of a way of passing it on to your opponent. Obviously, you can't not check the king like you're in check. Check's probably not the right word. You can't pass a turn in chess. Obviously, when it's your turn to move, you have to make a move, but you can kind of do one of these waiting moves or shuffle a piece. And the idea is that you're hoping your opponent will force things and blunder. But in these positions where you're not sure what to do, here are some ideas. And a lot of these do come from Silman because even he acknowledges that this happens sometimes where you're just going to be stuck for a plan. So when you're not sure of a plan, number 1 is to stop counterplay. So maybe you don't have a long-term plan, but you see that your opponent might have a possible attack, might be able to expand on a certain side of the board, might be able to find a good square for one of his pieces. Try to stop his counterplay and ideas so you can think defensively. Second, try to improve the position of your pieces. All right, now if the position is very closed and very locked, you can often do a lot of slow maneuvering because time isn't important. It's not this wild tactical thing where time and tempo is important. If it's very closed and very locked, slow maneuvering, and this is something Silman talks about, slow maneuvering becomes very important. So try to improve the position of your pieces. Maybe get a bishop on a better diagonal. Maybe get a knight on a good square. Maybe move the rook towards the center. Something like that. I mean, that's that old expression, right? When you're not sure what to do, just kind of shuffle your rook towards the center. It's not really that accurate, but there's a certain amount of validity to that thinking. All right, the third thing you can do is try to restrict the opponent's pieces, maybe block diagonals for his bishop, take away squares for his knight, close off an entrance for his rooks on a file. So these sort of prophylactic ideas are very, very good when you're not sure how to come up with a plan. All right, or you're not sure what the plan is, I should say. The other thing you can do, which kind of goes along with that, you can trade your inactive piece for your opponent's active piece. That's always good. Now, again, with all these, you got to check them tactically. But if you have a bad bishop, this is sort of the classic example. If you have a bad bishop, if your light squared bishop is bad and your opponent's light squared bishop is good, try to trade it. That's actually a theme, for example, in the French defense, right? Because in the French defense, particularly the advanced variation, obviously in the exchange variation, that's a different thing. But in the classical variation or the advanced variation, the traditional bad piece for black is the light squared bishop. And one of black's plans is to trade the bishop for white's, right? Which is what you want to do, because white's light squared bishop is usually a very strong attacking piece, a very active piece in the French. Black's light squared bishop is very passive and a bad bishop in the French. When we say bad bishop, for those of you who may be starting out, a bad bishop is blocked by your own pawns, so it has no scope. So you want to trade it for your opponent's active piece. That's just an example, the light squared bishop in the French defense, but there are many other examples where you can trade your inactive piece for your opponent's active piece. So just to run that down real quick, if you're not sure of a plan, try to stop counterplay, improve the position of your pieces, restrict the opponent's pieces, and you can trade your inactive piece for your opponent's active piece. Now, if all those fail, that's when you may want to look into a type of waiting move. Now, some people are going to say, well, with these waiting moves, it's too passive. But what I'm saying, I'm trying to, and this is my opinion, I'm trying to give you a realistic way to play at the amateur level. Like when you're sitting at the club, in other words, I don't want you to blunder, right? Because most games, let's face it, as I mentioned, most games, it's usually going to be won because somebody blundered. But if neither side is blundering, you do have to use some of these other strategies. But here's the deal. I want you to do well in your games, and I would rather you play a waiting move, a quote-unquote passive move that doesn't really change the nature of the position, and you're not blundering and you're still in the game. I'd rather you do that than try to force a plan because, I have to come up with a plan. That's what my coach said. That's what Silman said. That's what this book said. That's what this chessable course said. I have to come up with a plan. But I'd rather you play sort of a nothing move that doesn't change anything than force a plan where you just couldn't think of one. And that's what I meant before when I said, when they say, the expression is a bad plan is better than no plan. No, that is completely not true. A bad plan is awful and you shouldn't play it. But that's what happens when you sort of study positional chess and when you're told, oh, that's too passive. You end up forcing something that you don't understand because you feel you have to come up with a plan. You don't need to come up with a plan on every move. I mean, sure, that would be nice, but I'm just telling you realistically, like it's just not going to happen. There are going to be way too many positions where you're just not sure what to do. And in those cases, play that waiting move instead of forcing a plan you don't understand. Play that waiting move, and you know what's going to happen? Within a few moves, then you'll start to see a plan. Okay? Now, obviously, you're not going to play a waiting move and then your opponent mates you, or you're not going to play a waiting move and then your opponent has a tactical shot. I'm assuming you're playing these waiting moves after you've assessed that your opponent has no threats, right? So that's a given. Let's keep that in mind. You've assessed that there's no threats. You've assessed that you don't have any tactics, but you're not sure what to do. So what I'm saying is, rather than force a plan that you don't understand because you feel you have to have a plan, you can just play one of these waiting moves or come up with one of these other ideas about stopping counterplay or improving the position of your pieces. Find something, even if it doesn't seem like a strong plan. I'd rather you play something more passive than you try to force it and it's a blunder. That's my take. A lot of people are going to criticize what I just said, but I've just seen this as a player, as a TD, as someone who runs a chess club, where so many games are lost because players force things, because they just feel they have to come up with a plan, or they're just not comfortable with a passive move or a waiting move if they're not sure. They feel every move has to have like meaning. Every move has to either be a check or it has to attack something. But if you overstretch, if you sort of overextend yourself on the board and you're not sure what's happening, that's when you get into trouble. The short answer of that is I'd rather you play a quiet or a passive move when you're not sure what to do than try to come up with some contrived plan that you don't understand just because you feel you have to have a plan. I think at the amateur level, that'll keep you in good stead. Now, stronger players may criticize that, but you got to remember, we're talking about the amateur player. For a grandmaster, they're obviously not going to think that way. If a grandmaster does this whole waiting move idea, if they don't have a plan, they're going to get into trouble. They're going to get crushed. But that's not what we're talking about here. All right. So if a GM criticizes what I'm saying, which is fine. I mean, I'm just an amateur player, but they're in a different ecosystem than we are. Okay. It's just a different thing. And it's much more important at our level to not blunder than to try to come up with some fancy plan. I think I've used that quote. It's by Larry Evans, the late, great Grandmaster Larry Evans. He said that it's better to not do anything stupid than to come up with some fancy tactical shot or something. I'm butchering the quote, but that was the idea. His whole thing was, it's far more important that you simply don't blunder. And that's all I'm saying. That's kind of a short way of what I'm telling you, because I just see so many players, and I've gone through this myself, where you try to force a plan. You're looking at a position, you're frustrated, you don't know what to do, and then you try to force something because it's somehow a hit on your ego that you don't know what the right plan is. But it's just going to get you into trouble. So let me summarize my criticism, or really my nitpicks, with Silman's imbalances, because again, I just want to be clear. I believe in the system, absolutely. I'm just saying there are some caveats and some things to keep in mind, and that you shouldn't take it too literally. His system of imbalances is a tool. It's helped me tremendously. It's helped my game tremendously, but there are a few pitfalls if you're not careful. So just to summarize my nitpicks with his system, you need to make sure you check for threats and tactics first before you consider any positional and strategic aspects, right? You have to say, what is the threat? I just think Silman doesn't emphasize that nearly enough. Number two, his system can lead to perfectionism, which then leads to time pressure and decision fatigue and possibly a blunder. Don't underestimate the power of adequate moves rather than perfect moves. I mean, even Anand adopts that philosophy. He's known for making more adequate moves rather than always perfect moves. They discuss that in Chess for Tigers, I believe. And that's Anand. So basically, Silman is sometimes too dismissive of alternate moves or second or third best moves that are perfectly fine. I get that he wants you to understand the position and he wants you to find the best move, but realistically, in a tournament, you don't need to do that. And if you always try to find the best move, you're just going to get into time pressure. You're going to get into trouble. So don't dismiss the power of these alternate or adequate moves. It doesn't have to be the number one engine move every time. And realistically, it's not going to be. And then the third thing, which kind of goes along with that, you don't need to utilize the imbalances on every move. And he has a quote, I think it's in the Amateur's Mind. It might be Reassess Your Chess. I think it's the Amateur's Mind, where he says something like, you should always ask yourself, what wonderful thing does this move do for my position? That can be overblown, because if you're not going to make a move unless you say, what wonderful thing does this do for my position, you're going to get into trouble. You're going to miss threats and you're going to think just offensively, and it can lead to perfectionism. I think that's overblown, right? Because not every move you make is going to feel like it's doing something wonderful for your position, right? You don't want to worry about controlling a square if you're missing the fact that your opponent has mate in 3. And again, there are going to be positions where a plan is unclear and you don't want to force things because you feel like you have to have a plan. His system is just one tool in your toolkit. I think it's an essential system. I think it's important, but I think you get my point that you can kind of take it too far. I'd now like to address others' criticism of Silman's imbalances. Did I say that right? Others with an apostrophe after the S? Yeah, I believe I did. Anyway, others have criticized Silman's imbalances, and you may have heard of some of these. I want to address them in the spirit of fairness, in the spirit of thoroughness. Like, you all know that I love his system despite its flaws. I love the amateur's mind. A lot of people disagree. Well, I don't know if it's a lot, but a bunch of people do not agree with his philosophy. And if you search it, you can find that stuff out there, like on the internet. Anyway, here is one criticism that's out there of Silman's imbalances, is that the first one, his system is too results-oriented or retroactive. I mean, I don't know if that's the best way to describe it. Let me explain. The argument is that he's discussing a position after having studied and analyzed it after the fact for a long period of time, and that it's not possible to think this way during the game where you can't possibly see every outcome. In other words, it's more of an analysis tool than an accessible thinking system during the game. That's basically what the argument is. It's about looking at the position after the fact and not really something that you can realistically use during the game. But here's the thing. Many of his positions are from his games, so he used them during tournament play. I guess you could argue that he may have had a different thought process during the game and that he's throwing on labels later. Like, he's saying, well, I played this move here because, but the truth is during the game, it was more of an instinct thing, or it was just lucky. And now that he's analyzing it after, he's saying, oh yeah, I played this because of this imbalance. I don't really agree with that criticism. It's very provocative. It's very interesting, but basically the argument, again, is that it's too, I guess, retroactive, for lack of a better term, is that he's throwing on these labels and analyzing the positions after having studied it over and over, and that there's really no way you can think that way during the game. I don't agree with it, but it is a very provocative take. Another criticism is that his system of imbalances is just a marketing term for ideas that have existed for years. Now, here's the thing. Yeah, even if it is, that's not a bad thing. He's making these ideas digestible for the typical club player by coming up with this system. That's the whole point. He's not saying that his idea of, for example, the battle of the minor pieces, right? Making your bishop and knight, or bishops and knights, better than your opponents. He's not saying that he came up with that on his own. He's just putting his own label on it so that we at the amateur level can process it. So when they say that he's just marketing terms that have existed, yeah, that's the whole point, but he's making it more understandable. So for me, that criticism, it really doesn't make sense. Another criticism of his imbalances is that people think it just means finding the weaknesses or targets in the position. Now, Silman addresses that. He makes clear that imbalances are the differences in the position. So a weakness or a target, I guess, is part of those differences. So in other words, if someone has a weak pawn or a backward pawn, you would say that the imbalance is, well, white's pawn structure is solid, but black's is weaker. And then the fact that there's a target would be sort of under that umbrella. Now, here's the thing. We're getting into hair splitting now, but Silman's whole thing is that the imbalances are the differences in the position. And then I guess weaknesses or targets would stem from that. But like I said, now we're kind of getting into annoying hair splitting, but that criticism has been put out there. Now, probably the most well-known criticism of Silman's system is from Willie Hendricks in his book, Move First, Think Later. I remember a number of years ago when this came out, this was a big thing. It's probably the most visible criticism of Silman. And Hendricks basically argues, I'm just speaking in broad strokes here. He basically argues that his system of imbalances and his thinking system is unrealistic, that no one thinks that way. He also argues, as I have, and here I agree with him, that Silman is sometimes too dismissive of alternate moves. But here's the thing, and I'm giving my opinion. Now, I do not like Hendricks's book. Now, I'm never going to say a book is like bad if I don't like it. I'm just going to give my own opinion. Like, no one can fault me for that. In my personal opinion, I don't think Hendricks's book is very good. I am not saying that because of the Silman criticism. I'm not going to say I don't like a book just because he's criticizing Silman, because I know some of you might be thinking, oh, he's criticizing your guy. So no, that's not what it is. I don't like Hendricks's book, just because I just don't think it's good. I think it's a poorly written book. It's very random. It's just a collection of random thoughts. It's very desultory. It's all over the place. I actually gave my copy to someone at the club many years ago, or I sold it to them for like a few bucks. I think I was just too lazy to return it. The thing is, when Hendricks says that no one thinks that way, it seems like he was referring to GMs. But Silman is focused on amateurs, so it's not a valid criticism. That's because most of these positional ideas and the imbalances are instinctive and second nature for high-level players. So of course they're not going to think the same way as amateurs. At that level, they're not really going to use checklists or anything the way some of us will, because they're at such a level that all of that is instinctive. So Hendricks essentially applies Silman's system to the wrong crowd. Okay, Silman didn't write The Amateur's Mind and Reassess Your Chess for GMs. His imbalances are aimed at club players who need a framework because they obviously don't have the same skills or experience or study time of the top players. So when Hendricks says, well, nobody thinks that way, it's clear from his prose that he was referring to high-level players. At least that's my interpretation. So Silman was trying to make essential positional and strategic concepts accessible to the typical club player. And as such, I think Hendricks's criticism is invalid. Now, if you're interested in more on this, there's an article on chess.com from 2014 that Silman wrote, which is a response to Hendricks's criticism. I'll link it in the show notes if you want to check it out. In that same article, a little bit of a side note here, Silman also kind of bashes the book Rapid Chess Improvement by Michael Della Mazza, which I agree, just my opinion, is not very good. I mean, there's basically nothing in it. It's basically a low-rent version of the woodpecker method, where you just do the same series of tactics over and over. Now, I want to be clear. Woodpecker method, from what I understand, is supposed to be very good. It's much more sophisticated. I'm not going to comment on sort of the effectiveness of the woodpecker method because I haven't used it. So I'm not really qualified to speak about that. I'm just saying that Rapid Chess Improvement, I guess, was sort of I don't want to call it a precursor, but it was kind of a similar idea of picking the same tactical exercises and doing them over and over. But the thing with Rapid Chess Improvement, the reason the book is probably so popular is because the title is a big clickbait, right? Rapid Chess Improvement, right? Who wouldn't want to pick that up? It's like all those YouTube titles. Oh, I got to 1900 just playing this opening, or crush your opponent, with this move, or how to gain 200 rating points in just 14 days. Like all those clickbait titles. And the thing is, they work, because even when you know that, all right, that's got to be a scam, what do? We still click on it, right? Like if I saw something on YouTube that said, increase your rating by 200 points in 1 month, I know that it's just going to be not a scam, but I know it's just going to be like nonsense. I know it's just a clickbait title, but what happens? We click on it anyway, right? It's like a car accident, right? You have to look, and there's some research that supports that. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent, but I'm going to bring it back. So bear with me. We all know about kissing up to the boss at work, right? They call it brown nosing. And we may think that it's somehow a bad thing, or in the long run, it's probably not good. But there's research that shows that it actually works, and that it works even when your boss knows what you're doing, because the research shows that it's far more important that your boss likes you rather than your productivity. I mean, this is just a couple of studies, but I think it's fascinating that even when your boss knows you're doing it, brown nosing still works. So in other words, just to be clear, just so I'm saying this correctly, kissing up to the boss or brown nosing the boss, the studies suggest that it works even when your boss knows exactly what you're doing. So your boss is thinking, oh yeah, he's kissing up to me, but it still works. Even when they know what you're doing, it still works. And it's the same thing. Now I'm bringing it back to chess. It's the same thing with these clickbait titles, right? We see all these titles that promise you to, become a master in a year or increase your rating in a week, all these things. And we know that somehow it's not true, but what do? We click on it anyway. So I think with that book, Rapid Chess Improvement, the title is very attractive, but I don't really think there's much in the book. Just my opinion. I know others are going to disagree. Others are going to like it. Just giving my opinion. Okay. I wouldn't waste your time with it. I'm guessing many of you may have heard of it. There's really not much in there. And I just mentioned it because in the same article where he addresses Hendrix's criticism, he also mentions Rapid Chess Improvement. So I wanted to complete my discussion of Silman and the imbalances by looking at the other side of it, looking at some caveats and some criticism, and keeping the discussion balanced. But the bottom line, despite some potential pitfalls, Silman's system is essential for improvement. It's excellent, and it's extremely beneficial. It's helped me tremendously. And while we did kind of look at sort of the dark side of it, I guess, the pros far outweigh the cons. So as you know, I implore you to become familiar with his work because I do feel his system is essential for improvement, but I just kind of wanted to be thorough as far as some of the pitfalls that you can run into if you don't apply it correctly and in a balanced way. So as always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you win your next game.